She had, I think, a deep moral sense, Muriel Spark, and had a moral sense that was informing how she was writing. And so I think she's trying to get at that transfiguration is so important to her to take us deeper and in her own, I think, faith, right? To take us even to an encounter with the divine, possibly, through that transfiguration of the ordinary, to suddenly see something more there than we perhaps thought was there.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Well, Callie Tabor is an assistant professor of the Department of Catholic Studies here at Sacred Heart University. She received her PhD in theological studies from Emory University in Atlanta. Her research focuses on theological aesthetics, especially questions of beauty's significance to faith, which is really an interesting subject in itself. I'd like to be talking about that too, because one of the nice things about being a Catholic is there's a lot of aesthetic beauty in the church, in the churches themselves. And some of the greatest artists in the history of Western art were Catholic or working for the Catholic Church. Made a movie on that subject called The Face of Jesus in Art.
Oh, fantastic.
So, which was quite a big deal. At any rate, today we are talking about this. We're talking about this book, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, Muriel Sparks. It's another British author, actually Scottish author, and you lived in Scotland for a while, and we may talk about that at the end. But let's really kind of get into it if we can.
Of course.
And I'd like to know about Jean Brodie herself. The book keeps referring to her as being in her prime, and of course it's even in the name of the book. And her girls, Jean Brodie, Miss Jean Brodie is a teacher at a fancy private school, not Catholic, a fancy private school in Scotland, and it keeps referring to her. The book keeps referring to her as being in the prime, and she has these 4 or 5 girls who are called Brodie girls, and they are the creme de la creme. Can you fill us in, please, on that? And thank you for being with us.
Yes, and that question of beauty is one we may circle back to in this conversation, even because beauty is quite significant to Miss Brodie herself.
And she was apparently a beautiful young woman.
She was, and we hear she has this sort of Roman profile. We keep hearing about this, and her sense of her own beauty seems significant to her, which kind of ties into, I think, her presentation of being in her prime. So first of all, we have a sort of biographical factor for Muriel Spark, which is that this school that she describes in Miss Brodie is closely tied to her own experience of going to a boarding school in Edinburgh called the James Gillespie School. And she kind of translates that into this Marcia Blaine School for girls. And she had a teacher, Miss Christina Kay, in her own life, and it seems like she gave a lot of the characteristics that her teacher had to the character Miss Brodie. So we have a sort of connection to Spark's own life. The use of prime over and over seems to me to have a couple of things going on for it. So first of all, I think it's supposed to be bringing us into an awareness that this is a woman who is of a particular generation where she's following. We hear she had a lover from the First World War who died, right? He passed away, and we're not yet to the Second World War. So she's part of this generation who are interwar period where a lot of the men have passed away and they don't have husbands or, have a long-term partner. And so this kind of reference to her prime over and over again, I think in part is her trying to claim that piece of herself that she doesn't get to live out in the same way that she might have expected to had her boyfriend Hugh lived. The other thing is that when she keeps saying it over and over and over again, you can't help but wonder as a reader, well, is she in her prime? It starts to feel a little bit like maybe you as the reader are supposed to be second guessing that a little bit, because you can't help but think, well, if you have to say it so much, it might not actually be true. We don't know exactly her age range, but based on the flash forwards and the flashbacks, which are used quite a lot in this novel. We can assume she was probably about 40 when the novel starts. So somebody who's kind of middle of life and trying to claim a value for herself in a society where, again, the kind of traditional ways she would have found value through marriage are kind of being denied to her because of this time period she lives in.
It's interesting. You talk about prime, and I kept enjoying that terminology. It's one, of course, I knew, but you don't hear anybody refer to it today. For example, I wouldn't consider myself in my prime at this age. I would consider you likely in your prime, but you really think about what even does that mean? I mean, maybe I am in my prime now, because, you've had a whole big, long life behind me that I'm kind of standing on. And maybe you're not in your prime because you got all this ahead of you. But the way it was then defined, or at least thought about, I know, was mostly sexual, I think, probably.
Absolutely. I think that is the case. Prime, Muriel Sparks says this herself in an interview later in her life, is not a word we use in the same way. But she said growing up, it was very common to have it heard.
Interesting.
Yes. And I think definitely that connection to romantic life was very significant for her. I think that for Miss Brodie, the sense is that she's past her prime once she's no longer in a relationship, because she has this kind of proxy relationship with the art teacher, but then she does go and pursue the relationship with the singing teacher instead. So once that's over, but also it seems to be a little bit about power, right? Her prime is over when she no longer has the power and the authority of being in her teaching position.
Very true. By the way, we refer to and we've been reading what we call Catholic books. Now, this book was written when, in about the 1960s or something?
1961.
1961. Muriel Sparks was a Catholic convert.
Yep.
So she is Catholic when she writes this. But it sure doesn't seem like the other books we've been talking about on this series. Doesn't seem I expected, more pious kinds of. These are hardly pious books. Where's the Catholic in all of this? Is the question I ask.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, there's a couple of different ways to think about where the Catholic is. So first of all, we hear the Catholic come through in sort of subtle ways within the novel itself, and not so subtle in the fact that we hear Sandy Stranger, the student who becomes like the kind of foil to Miss Jean Brodie, ends up becoming a nun.
Yes.
So Catholicism is in there. And in oblique ways, it's there from the very beginning, because one of the interesting things Miss Brodie says in the first few pages, when she's sort of introducing her teaching style and her philosophy, is she takes the girls into the headmistress's office where there's a portrait of the former prime minister. And it says something about safety comes first. And she tells the girls, safety does not come first. Goodness, truth, and beauty, these come first. Well, goodness, truth, and beauty are for Catholics. They are the transcendentals. They are the properties of being that we associate with what it means for something to express the goodness, truth, and beauty of God. So we have that kind of presence of the divine hinted at from the very beginning. But then it kind of weaves its way in, and we get these little comments where we hear that attraction that Miss Brodie has to the goodness, truth, and beauty means that she should have maybe been a Catholic. Actually, the novel suggests, but she isn't. Sandy's the one who ends up a Catholic, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about why that is. But the other piece to the kind of where's the Catholic in all this, is that Muriel Sparks herself, once she converted, she actually didn't start writing novels until after she converted. And she gave this sense that becoming Catholic gave her a sense of what it is to be human, and that she couldn't have written novels without that. But she said for her, it was like a norm that she could depart from. So much of what she's doing in her novels is showing people who are actually departing from that Catholic way of things. And you're supposed to sort of intuit through your reading what may have gone awry by departing from that norm. She wasn't somebody who was going to expound on her faith in a really big way. She once quoted John Henry Newman, who was very influential to her conversion, who said, "I can't speak about my conversion as simply as if it was something that came between the soup and the fish course at dinner."
Oh, you were very good, Callie. I really enjoy listening to you. Let's talk about Miss Brodie as a teacher and her philosophy of teaching. You touched on that a little bit, but she's teaching in this very kind of conservative private girls' school in Edinburgh, and they're trying to get rid of her because she's very, I don't know, I guess I'd say now liberal, but not really. I mean, something else. She's not on the organized track. Let's put it that way. So, want to backfill that a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is this kind of complicated thing where is she progressive or is she not?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I
absolutely. Because what we hear is, for example, so she's teaching in the junior school, and then the girls kind of go up to the senior school, and the way it still works in the UK to this day is you kind of focus your subjects in your tracks a little bit as you get older. But at the time, the way that works is you pick either the modern track or the classical track. And now thinking of her as progressive, we might say, oh, she's going to go for the modern track. No. She's going to go for the classical track because she has this sense, again, of art, of beauty. She says art and religion come first, then philosophy, then science. Science to her is the least important, and that is the modern thing. So she's resistant to that. She has this sort of appreciation for the beautiful things and for the kind of classical world. You see that especially in her obsession with Italy. She's very interested in Italy, which has a dark side to it as well that we can talk about. But she explains at one point her teaching philosophy with a little line that you might not catch it the first time you read it, where she's contrasting herself to the other teachers, especially Miss Mackay, who's the headmistress. And she says what those teachers want to do is they want to fill your head with information. They essentially want to keep giving you information and you just swallow it down. And she says, I think of education from the Latin, again, the kind of classical thing. And she says, ex duco, to lead out, is what education is. She says, I see my role as leading out the girls, leading out what's in their soul. Well, that kind of idea of leading out what's in the soul comes straight from Plato, actually. So we're getting an implicit reference to Plato there, who in Plato's Cave says that what education is not just filling your mind with a lot of things, but rather is a turning the soul around. The most fundamental thing about education is to turn your soul so that it's pointing towards what is good. The question then becomes for Miss Brodie, if she thinks that's what she's doing, is turning that soul around for the girls, is she actually pointing them towards the good? And I think that's where the novel starts to interrogate her a little bit, is this very charismatic figure who certainly leads the girls, but does she lead them towards the good, is the kind of question.
Yeah, and that's, of course, where the novels that we've been talking about during this little series have made us think. They've made us think about what's good and what isn't, and these very complicated things. Also, you mentioned this teaching approach. Isn't that really the teaching approach that one of the greatest universities in the world, Oxford, uses? You sit around and you kind of tutorials, yes. Sit and talk and think about things. You're not just dumped a bunch of facts.
Absolutely. I think there's something really admirable in that approach. I mean, here even at this university, that's the main type of teaching that I do, is that sort of Socratic method, right? This conversation together with the students. But I think there is an acknowledgement that even in the kinds of questions you're asking, you're inviting the students to think a certain way. The other thing we see with Miss Brodie is she doesn't always follow her own claims about what she's doing educationally. So in that kind of Socratic method, we might expect her to ask a question and to let the students come to their conclusions. But we see, for example, one time she's asking the students who the greatest artist is. And one of the girls volunteers, oh, Leonardo da Vinci. And she says, no, Giotto, he's my favorite. And so it's actually really about making them almost in her image in some kind of way. And that's where I think the kind of interrogation of her claims about education comes in, is if we compare what she's saying to what she's actually doing.
Yeah, very tricky thinking has to go on in this book. What about, Sparks living in Scotland and Calvinistic the power of the Calvinistic Protestantism and Catholicism, both working one against another. Where would you say all this fits in this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's an interesting interweaving of these two different traditions that both have significant influences on Scottish religious identity in particular. And, Muriel Spark, when she wrote this novel, she had already moved she grew up in Edinburgh, she was married and briefly, and then she moved to New York. And she came back, actually, to Edinburgh in order to write this novel because she had this sense, I cannot write this story without being in this place that I grew up in. She actually wrote it in 6 weeks, if you can believe it. Yes. She's a very quick writer. But she went back there because I think there was something about that, not just the place in the physical sense, but the kind of atmosphere of Edinburgh, which is deeply informed, I think, by the religion that kind of is there in the Calvinistic sense and in the Roman Catholic sense. So I think from the Calvinistic side, right, the kind of most famous aspect of that Scottish Calvinism is this sense of double predestination, which is the teaching that not only are some people destined to go to heaven by God, but many of us, and maybe most of us, are already predestined to go to hell. So here you have this God who is quite fierce, certainly to be feared in maybe a literal sense, but also a God who, if you feel that you are justified by that God, if you are one of the elect, which is the language that we use, one of the chosen, you're sort of above morality on some level. Yes. Because you're chosen. So what you do doesn't really matter because God has chosen your salvation. And it's interesting that we hear Sandy, as she begins to sort of question Miss Brodie and wonder about her methods, at one point she says she thinks she is Providence. She thinks she is the God of Calvin. And so her critique of Miss Brodie is that Miss Brodie has taken on that sense of being one of the elect, and maybe even more than that, the God of the elect, the Calvinistic God, that it's to her to say who is saved and who is damned. And you see that sort of in her choosing of this Brodie set, right? She's interested in those girls only, and the rest she kind of ignores. I mean, we hear at one point there's another girl who tries to join in, and she comes over, and Miss Brodie says, "Oh, nice to meet you. Well, we must be going now." Makes no attempt to include her at all in the group. And then on the flip side, we've got the presentation of Roman Catholicism, which, as I've already said, is tied to Sandy's conversion, but it's also deeply tied to the presentation of art and beauty in this novel. I think the reason we hear that Miss Brodie should have been a Catholic is that she has that attraction to the beautiful, to the aesthetic. What she lacks, perhaps, is we heard the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty. She might lack a little on the goodness and the truth.
Right. Yeah.
And so the suggestion of the novel is that if you just have the beautiful, you can go awry. You can go awry. And we hear that even, I think, in the presentation of Miss Brodie's attraction to fascism. And actually, Sandy, once she converts, she admits she finds an awful lot of fascists in the Catholic Church. And again, it seems to be that inference that you might be very attracted to what's beautiful. I mean, that certainly seems to be part of what Miss Brodie is attracted to in fascism, is this sense that it is aesthetically pleasing to her. But without that commitment to goodness and truth alongside it, you can become somebody who's quite willing to go along with evil because it's attractive.
Yes. Interesting. Well, let's talk. We have been talking about Sandy for those who haven't read the book yet. Sandy is... she was a very unappealing character. She was one of the Brodie girls, one of the 5 or 4 Brodie girls, and but very unappealing. She frequently described her eyes as being very small. I'd like to know a little about that. Very small eyes and just very unappealing. On the other hand, she was a model for this artist, the art teacher. She was a model for him, and later had a relationship that Miss Brodie wanted, but that never had. And then, but interestingly, of all the people, and nobody was Catholic in this, or no, I guess the art teacher was. She is the one that becomes a nun. How does all this make some sense of this for me? Even reading the book, I couldn't figure it all out.
It's hard, and I think the character of Sandy remains a little elusive for us, even if you've read the novel a few times. You know, Spark is somebody who's known for bringing together this kind of comedy of manners type of writing with this sort of supernatural, slightly postmodern thing. And I think it's when you get that part that it starts to feel like, I'm not quite sure what she's doing here. Right. I think Sandy, a simple reading would just say Sandy is the heroine, right? She's kind of the one who comes in and corrects Miss Brodie. And I think at the same time, we get some clues along the way that Sandy is not being set up as simply blameless herself, right? And first of all, we got those beady little eyes, right? We're told every one of the Brodie set is kind of given a characteristic that marks them out. And at first, we're told that Sandy is merely notorious for her eyes, but that she's famous for her vowels. But as the novel goes on, the thing we hear about is not her vowels, but the eyes. It keeps coming back to those eyes. And I think there's a way to consider the eyes as showing Sandy as somebody who's extremely perceptive on the one hand. She's kind of always watching and looking, but also that she maybe has a certain kind of cunning to her. And certainly we see that she's somebody who, of the Brodie set, is the most sort of able to kind of see or interpret what Miss Brodie's motive might be or what she thinks Miss Brodie's motive might be, and to rebel against that in some way. So you referred to the art teacher, who interestingly, as you said, is the only Catholic, at least in the beginning of this story. He's married. He has 6 children. And that seems to be why Miss Brodie does decide not to enter into an affair with him. She does respect that he's a married man. And so instead, she herself has a relationship with the singing teacher who's a bachelor. But at the same time, she can't quite seem to let him go. And so she has this plan to have one of her girls sort of act as a surrogate for her. So disturbing if we think about it as a teacher, as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is really shockingly immoral.
It is. It's completely. But the person she has in mind for that affair is actually not Sandy. She has in mind another of her students. Yes, Rose Stanley, who, again, saying all these girls have a little trait. Rose Stanley is famous for sex. That is the trait that she's associated with. But what's interesting is, again, the novel goes on to show us Rose really isn't all that sexual as a person. No. It's more something that Miss Brodie puts onto her than is actually true of how she acts and behaves in the world. Sandy is the one who Miss Brodie sets up as her sort of intellectual surrogate. So she has in mind, Sandy is going to carry out the sort of insight that Miss Brodie thinks she has, and Rose is going to carry out the part that is the affair. But Sandy starts to resent the role that she's been set out by Miss Brodie. And so she goes, and she's the one who in the end actually has the affair with the art teacher. And Miss Brodie is horrified by that because she had, again, if we think about her as a character who thinks of herself as sort of playing with the pieces on the board, who are predestined to do what she wants, Sandy's just violated that. She's just shown, well, on some level, some free will, right? But she's done it in a way that's specifically aimed at trying to both take on a role that Miss Brodie wants one of the girls to, but to do it in a way that violates how Miss Brodie wants it to happen, right? And the interesting thing is that once this affair is over, what we hear is that Sandy rejects the man, kind of discards him eventually, like a husk, it says, but she takes from him the religion. So it's as if something about his commitment to this faith sticks with her in some way, even after she's long over the affair.
It's very complicated. And then to add to the complexity of this book, which, by the way, many critics also say is funny, humorous.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I think it is this use of the word prime and all this other stuff. But it's still not that funny for me. But the thing that was really difficult was the way, and this is the first time I've ever really read a book this way, where it would jump around in context. You'd go forward, you'd go backward. The time structure was very complicated. How does all that fit into your thinking and reading here?
Yeah, that's something that Muriel Spark is really known for. It's something she does in a number of her novels, is this flash forward, flash back, so that you're a little destabilized about where you even are. And I think part of what's going on is her own approach to being an authorial authority, because she recognizes that there is a sort of godlike quality to being the author as well. So it's not just that Miss Brodie takes that on, it's that she as an author is very aware of this. And actually, in her very first novel, The Comforters, she describes the character as becoming aware that she herself is in a novel and kind of having to respond back to the author, because she's, I think, throughout her writing, very concerned with the ethics of writing, right? and if there is an ethical way to write and to have this kind of control over your characters. To what extent can you control your characters, and to what extent do they have a life of their own, you know? And so I think that flashback, flash forward that she does is showing she's playing a little bit with that kind of authority. And at the same time, I also think she's using it to destabilize our trust in Miss Brodie and to destabilize our sense that what she's setting up here with this little set is necessarily a good thing. Because as she flashes forward and flashes back, we kind of start to see, well, for instance, most famously, we see that Mary McGregor, who's the poor girl who's famous for being a silent lump. I mean, those moments of that sort of stinging humor. She dies when she's 23 in a fire. And many of the girls then throughout the novel have moments where they think, I should have been nicer to Mary McGregor. But Sandy at one point says, well, I wanted to be nicer to Mary McGregor. One time, again, we're back when they're teenagers, and I wanted to be nicer to her. But I realized if I was nicer to her, it would go against the roles Miss Brodie had set up for us. It would disturb that in some way, and so that I couldn't do it. I had to be mean to her. And so I think getting those flashbacks and flash forwards, again, is there in some ways to say, well, if we were just with Miss Brodie the whole way through and we didn't find out to the very end that Mary McGregor dies, you as a reader might not feel quite so much that, yes, they ought to have been nicer to Mary McGregor. But by having that at the very beginning, you know it would be important to be kind to her because look at this tragedy that befalls her.
Well, it's certainly a brilliantly written book. By the way, too, one of the, back to Sandy, the girl that becomes a nun, was, kind of the lowest of the Brodie girls in character, supposedly. Turns out to be the highest. But she had also written a book or something herself. And the book was titled The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. Do you want to tell me what you think that means?
Yeah, so this is something she writes. She goes on to study psychology, we just hear.
Yes.
Once she's through with Miss Brodie in schooling, and then she becomes a nun, and she writes the book in between. And so the transfiguration of the commonplace, if we think about what Sandy does throughout the novel and what Miss Brodie does is in their different ways, that's what they're both doing, right? Miss Brodie is interested in transfiguring the commonplace through her kind of use of art and poetry. You know, she's somebody we often hear, she's telling them a story or she's having them recite. One of the poems that keeps coming up is The Lady of Shalott, which is this sort of romantic poem describing this woman that's like trapped in a tower. And so you see her kind of constantly transforming the world to make it more romantic, to fit her romantic sensibilities. And Sandy, on her part, is always telling herself, even as Miss Brodie's telling a story, we hear often Sandy is telling herself a second story and sort of playing pretend in her own mind. Usually it's one of the books she's reading, or sometimes it's a story that she's heard. She'll make the people characters and she's playing pretend in her mind a little bit. So they both seem to have this talent for making the world more interesting to themselves in some way. And that talent, again, we get this sense can go for the good or for the bad, right? And Spark herself, when asked about that title, said, to me, the transfiguration of the commonplace is my definition of what it is to make art. So it was for her and her kind of own artistic philosophy what she was about. But again, I think because she had that deeply, even though, as we say, there's this sort of strangeness and sort of wickedness, she had, I think, a deep moral sense, Muriel Spark, and had a moral sense that was informing how she was writing. And so I think she's trying to get at that transfiguration is so important to her to take us deeper and in her own, I think, faith, right? To take us even to an encounter with the divine, possibly through that transfiguration of the ordinary, to suddenly see something more there than we perhaps thought was there. But if it goes the other way, right, you can transfigure it towards the evil as well.
Well, I wish I would have taken your class. Tell me, have you taught this book in your class? Have you actually taught it? And what the response of students is to this to this work?
So I haven't actually taught this novel in particular here, so I haven't had a chance to do that. I can tell you that myself, the first time I read it, I certainly felt the strangeness, just like you say, and sort of bewildered. Where am I supposed to find myself in between all these characters? I also found it, somewhat attractive that here you have this woman who is writing these very complex female characters. Sometimes I think in the Catholic tradition, the way that we present women is sort of quite one-dimensional, or can be. This sort of demure, loving, maternal sort of figure is sort of held up, right? And then we have Catholic novelists who are men, like Graham Greene, like Evelyn Waugh, who were her peers. And the way they write women tends to either do that or to show women as sort of one-dimensionally sort of bad, usually in a sort of sexual way. And so there's sort of dichotomy where you have a sort of Madonna, virgin-like figure, and then you have this sort of figure who is this sort of sexual figure who's a bad girl, exactly. And so Muriel Spark, what I find so interesting is that she presents you with these women who are certainly capable of evil, and so in that way very deeply human, but not just in that one note kind of way that we get with some of the other authors. So that's the thing that I found fascinating about her, even as I was sort of bewildered when first reading her.
Wow. Well, this is certainly a fascinating and interesting book. And thank you, Callie Tabor, for taking us through it. And more important, thank you for choosing the career you chose. You're awfully good at it.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you very much.
And would be a very rich experience, I'm sure you are, for your students and for all of us. So thank you for being here. I hope to have a chance to talk to you again.
Yes, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation. Appreciate it.